I spoke about the self. Khudi is the self. Khudi is probably Urdu or Farsi? Khudi. Urdu, yeah. Khudi is the self, and Dr. Iqbal, Muhammad Iqbal, is famous for having devoted a lot of attention to the subject of the self, the development of the self, and I analyzed the different dimensions of the self. I mentioned to you self-consciousness, self-directed will, creative intellect. But now I have to mention one more. In Akhiru Zaman, the model is Khidr alayhi salam. And Iqbal is referring to a Khidr when he said, and if you'll allow me to quote the verse in Urdu, it's not many verses I know in Urdu, but I know this one. हजारों साल नरगिस अपनी बेनूरी पे रोती है, बड़ी मुश्किल से होता है चमन में दीद आवर पैदा. That it is very difficult, says Iqbal, for that person to be born, that sage to be born, who sees with the noor of Allah. There is something called sight, and then there is internal sight. And if you take the first two letters of internal and you add it to sight, instead of internal sight, you get insight. Insight. So the one who sees with internal, intuitive, spiritual insight is the deed hour of Iqbal. And the model is Khidr alayhi salam, and this book has a very important chapter on the encounter of Musa and Khidr alayhi salam. But listen, when Allah speaks about Khidr alayhi salam in the Quran, He does not mention one, He mentioned two things. He says, وَعَلَّمْنَاهُ مِن لَدُنَّا عِلْمًا. We bestowed knowledge upon him directly from us, internally received. But he said something else. وَآتَيْنَاهُ رَحْمَةً مِّنْ عِنْدِنَا. We also gave him kindness. We also gave him rahmah. So if you are to acquire nur, if you are to reach the junction of the two oceans, if you are to see with the nur of Allah, never say, I will never forgive him. Huh? But Lord, forgive me? Doesn't make sense. You have to have a heart with kindness and compassion and forgiveness. The Prophet said, alayhi salatu wasalam, every act of kindness has its own reward. For on the day of trouble, that act of kindness will come to wash your troubles away. So you cannot walk the path of nur, to receive nur from Allah, to see with the internal eye, to reach the junction of the two seas, to be able to penetrate the reality of the world today and not be deceived by appearances. Unless, in addition to knowledge externally acquired, you have knowledge which is internally received. And also, that every fiber of your being, every single part of you displays kindness and compassion. Any more questions? The Malay are such a polite people, mashallah, except when some of them get behind a motor car to drive. I don't know where the Malay kindness goes when they drive a motor car. They become like Long Island Expressway. But the Malay are such a polite people, mashallah. If an Islamic bank is truly Islamic, why does it not raise its voice and call for the return of dinar and dirham? If a former Prime Minister of this country could do that, why can't the Islamic Bank do that? Number one, they won't do it. And I know why they won't do it. Number two, Nabi Muhammad ﷺ would buy goods on credit. Meaning you take the goods now and you pay later. And so a credit transaction is halal in Islam. But the shopkeeper never was allowed to raise his price because he had to wait for his money. No. If the shopkeeper raised his price because he had to wait for his money, the implication would be that money can increase over time. That's riba. And so in Islam, credit price and cash price are always the same. Is that so difficult to understand? Money has no time value in Islam. Yes, in Manhattan, but not in Islam. Islamic banks are engaged in a bogus transaction that they call murabaha, which brings in a substantial amount of their revenues. It's not murabaha. They call it murabaha. The house is on sale for, well, if it's Damansara Utama, let's make it 500,000 ringgits, huh? That's too low? 1 million. A house is on sale in Damansara Utama for 1 million ringgits. And you don't have the 1 million to pay for it, cash. So you want to buy it the way the Prophet ﷺ would buy goods, on credit. But the shopkeeper, which is now the bank, raises the price and now sells you the house for a higher price and gives you time to pay. The shopkeeper, which is the Islamic bank, is now selling the house for 3 million ringgits. Whereas if you had the cash, you could buy it for 1 million ringgits. So the cash price is 1 million and the credit price is 3 million. You don't need a PhD to understand that this is riba, except that this is a worse riba than the one from the conventional banks. The conventional banks is riba through the front door, and Islamic banks is riba through the back door. Any more questions? Yeah.
Am I to understand that?
The Prophet said that Dajjal will appear as a Jew. That's not symbolic, that's literal. He will be a young man. Can't be Netanyahu. No. And the last time I checked, Barack Obama was not a Jew. He says he's a Christian. Okay? Dajjal will appear as a human being, as a young man who would be a Jew, born of Jewish parents. He would be well built and he would have curly hair. And I always thought it meant curly hair on the head, until an Egyptian student stopped by in KL to say, Sheikh, you're wrong. It's not curly head. It's the curls that the Orthodox Jews have at the side here, these curls. That's what the Prophet is speaking about. So he'll be an Orthodox Jew. So there are parts of the subject of Dajjal which is symbolic, and parts which are literal. And it is with insight that you can separate the one from the other. Any more questions?